Okay, so we are now streaming to YouTube. And we are recording. And Amanda, if you can use the phone number call in, because we would like to have you be able to participate if there's questions or anything like that. So if you can use the computer to look at the PowerPoint, but you can use the call-in feature to hear the sound. And if you can mute yourself, I think maybe Julie is still unmuted. And if you can mute yourself, I think maybe Julie is still unmuted. I don't know if Julie has a microphone. It could be.
Actually, I just called in, so I'm going to mute my sound right now.
Okay. And then I just saw another number call in. The number ending 8962, who's that?
That's Amanda.
Okay. Okay, so it looks like I currently have Rochelle, Julie, Steve, myself, and Mr. Thomas, Amanda, Carlos, Julie. And if you can mute yourself, I think maybe Julie is still unmuted. Oh, I don't know. I apologize. I think we are hearing feedback from my YouTube. Okay, I will leave it to you all to call your meeting to order when you are ready.
Shelley, is Tino going to be on this call?
Okay, I see one more phone joining us, so I'll see who that is, and then I'll add a name. Amanda, that's you, 8960.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Sorry. I clicked over to talk to Shelley for just a second and I lost you guys. I apologize. I guess Tino is not going to be here, who is our president, so that leaves it up to me to run the meeting. So I guess I will call the meeting to order at 4:38 p.m.
Okay, great.
And okay, do you want me to go ahead and follow the agenda? It says the Pledge of Allegiance. Are we going to do that with all of us in different locations?
It's your meeting, so I'm just here for when you want us to
Okay. Okay. I think because we're in all different locations, we'll just skip that part because it'll be kind of interesting with everybody being on Zoom. If we can go on to, I need someone to approve the agenda.
I motion to approve the agenda.
Thank you, Steve. Can I get a second?
Amanda, do we have a second board member?
I don't think we have another board member. So there's actually only two of us on this call.
Okay.
Well, then we can't call the meeting to order.
No. I don't know who that Galaxy phone is on there.
Amanda,
Yes.
I'll second that motion.
Who is this?
Is this Troy?
Yes, it is.
Troy Ramirez.
I was
Okay.
trying to figure out how to unmute it.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to name your phone then. So now I have that as Troy. So now you do have 3 members
Yes.
and you have a second. So
Yes. Okay. So all those in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you. Okay, and we'll move on to the discussion items, which is the governing board training session.
great. All right. Well, thank you for having us. My name is Nikki Whaley, and I am a board support specialist with the Arizona School Boards Association. I do training and board development across the state. I also am a school board member myself in the Washington Elementary School District here in Phoenix. And today we have 2 topics we're going to go through. I'm going to go through in about an hour some basic roles and responsibilities. It may be a refresher for you all, but we're also going to be talking about 8 characteristics of effective boards. So some of the things boards can do to help improve student achievement. And then I'm joined here today with our Associate Executive Director and In-house Counsel, Chris Thomas, and he'll be spending the last part of our time together with open meeting law. And you'll have an opportunity to ask questions at that time, any questions that you have regarding the open meeting law as we go through that presentation. We will take a break in between the 2 so that we can transition. So that'll give you an opportunity to stretch your legs as well. If you do have questions throughout the meeting, you could just put in the chat, I have a question. We want to be careful not to have any kind of conversation using the chat feature. But if you would like to alert us that you have a question or need a break, please do that via the chat, and I will do my best to pay attention to that as I'm going through the slide deck. So with that, I'm going to move forward. Hopefully you're seeing my cover slide.
We are.
Wonderful. Okay, so this is the agenda. As I said, the first thing I want to talk a little bit about is creating a learning space. So what I'd like to do first is to just hear who I have on. I see some names, but I don't know much about you. So if we could go through to Amanda, Steve, and then Troy. And if you could just tell me who's speaking when you're on, because we also don't have any camera. So it'll be really important for you to identify yourselves when you speak. And then how long you've been on the board. And let's go with, we have your why. So why did you join the board, or why do you continue to serve? So if we want to start, we can start with Amanda.
Okay, my name's Amanda Kenny. I couldn't actually even tell you how long I've been on. It's been a long time. I want to say at least 5 or 6 years. I can't be 100% positive, but my why is because I care about my community, I care about my school, and I care about my children's education.
Thank you.
My name is Steve Skiro, and this is my first year on the board. So I'm very new to it. And the why is I taught previously for about 20 years. I retired, and I just wanted to get back into education in some way. And this is a very good way, I think. So that's why I'm on the board.
Thank you.
My name is Jonathan Troy Ramirez. I believe I've been on it. I'm going on my 3rd year. And why? My daughter's in high school, and I've always said that I would be involved and try and make a difference with the kids. You know, our kids come first, and to me, that's really important.
Great, thank you. And then Rochelle, why don't you go ahead and let us know how long you've been with the district, and what you maybe what you like about being in the district, what's been the best part of the district so far. Rochelle? Okay, well, I don't hear anything from Rochelle, so maybe we're having some mic issues. I know she's on, this is the first time I've done this where everybody is on computers that don't have sound or screen. So bear with me as I'm trying to get my bearings. Everybody's called in, and so it makes it a little bit more difficult to know when people know that I've acknowledged them or not. So we're going to go ahead and go forward. So we're going to start with a little bit of a pop quiz, and I'll ask anybody that feels like they know the answer. They can go ahead and unmute and share. First question is, how many bosses does the superintendent have?
School board is the boss. She has one boss.
Yes, that is correct. You have one boss, and that is the entire board. So that's really important thing to stress, because sometimes it can feel for many superintendents that they have 3 bosses or 5 bosses, however many board members there are. But really, the board as a whole is the only people or body that can direct the superintendent. And so it's important that all those formal directions are given to the superintendent via the board. Next question is, what is the authority of an individual school board member? And the answer to that is none, at least no more than any other citizens. So school board members derive their authority when they're in a public meeting, and they derive their authority through their votes on items that are listed as action items. Outside of that, they have no special access or authority than any other citizen. So we say that to mean that if you go to a campus, just because you're a board member doesn't mean that you can show up to a campus anytime you want and ask to do a tour, or attend or ask a director to do a formal report for you, or do any kind of project for you, or ask them to, or direct their work in any kind of way. Because just like the superintendent only has one boss, that's the board only has one employee, and that's the superintendent. So it's really important that the board remember that they really have authority only over the superintendent, and only as a body, not as individuals. And if you have questions along the way, make sure you let me know. So what is the authority of the governing board as a whole? It's a lot. The governing board is an essential body in the state of Arizona, because they are the local stewards of federal and state dollars, but they're also the people that are responsible for creating the system that the community wants in terms of how they want their kids educated. So the governing board has a lot of influence in this, and we're going to talk about how that is played out. They formally get their authority through Arizona revised statute. So by state law, governing boards are subdivisions of the state, and they are given their authority only by what is given to them according to the law. And those laws are 15.341 and 15.342, which include a list of things that are mandatory that you must do, and then things that are permissive or that you can do, but generally are delegated to the superintendent. So I'm going to make that a little bit easier than looking at, the whole statute, to say that some of the things that you cannot delegate. So the things that the board must do is the board must approve policy. They're the only body that can do that. So any policy or policy changes have to go through the governing board. They also finalize and pass the budget. So budget, of course, is created and worked with through staff, but ultimately it is the governing board, and only the governing board, that can approve that budget. And then finally, the hiring, firing, and evaluating of the superintendent. Only the board can do that, and it can't be delegated to another body. So we're going to do a little bit of, and usually I would have screens on so I could do thumbs up, thumbs down. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go through the scenarios, and then give you a moment to think about them, and then I'll give you the answers, because with no screens, I can't really see you and see those thumbs ups and thumbs down. So in this scenario, a board member has posted a question on Facebook asking for input on the high school teachers, on a high school teacher's behaviors and actions. The board member continues to post that her daughter is upset with the way the teacher runs the classroom and wants to know if others are having the same concerns. So the parent then takes all these comments to the superintendent and wants something to change in that classroom. Is that an oversight, meaning within the board's authority, or an overstep? And the answer for that is overstep. So this would be a situation in which it would not be appropriate for a board member to take to Facebook or to really even individually interview folks regarding the actions or the work of an employee. That is outside the realm of the board's duty. And in fact, if a board member were to do that and a teacher did have to go through some type of disciplinary process, it could cause some issues with that. It seems how that the board member was impartial. They may not be able to vote on any kind of action, and also can lead to some issues with the fact that the board member was out there talking about the employee's conduct in a public forum. Any questions there? Okay. So this is a visual that helps explain where the board and the administrative teams are separate and where they cross over. So on the right, you see that a governance team is about the what. What is it that we believe in? What is our vision for our district? What are our priorities as a board in order to best serve our students? And what policies and or budget priorities do we need to put forward in order to see those things, in order to support the staff and making sure that those things happen? So it's really the 30,000-foot view of the what it is that we want to see. The administration, on the other hand, are the ones that are going to come up with the strategies, tactics, and techniques. So they are going to talk to us about the how. And that's an important distinction, because the what, remembering that we're elected officials and we are representing our community, it is our responsibility to tell the administration what it is that we want out of our education system and what our expectations are. But most of us are not, and by design, education experts. We're supposed to be representative of the community. Nobody needs to have a certain level of education, or nobody has to be a former teacher, administrator, any of those things to run for the governing board. That's why we have our staff. And so that's why it's important that the staff that do have the expertise are the ones that come forward with the strategies, tactics, and techniques. There's that place in the middle where people talk about, where the board and the administration come together and they talk about that. So for example, the board will say, hey, these are our priorities. And the administration will come and say, well, these are some of the strategies and tactics that we have to meet those priorities. And then you give feedback as a board, yes, that's in line with what we were thinking, or did you think about this or the other thing? Conversely, the administration might come to the board with a budget or with policy direction and say, we think we need this budget or these policies for these reasons. And the board will ask questions and then go forward with the policies or budget that they see as the most appropriate. In general, the board's role is to govern. So they're supposed to do that oversight, which is a very general, higher level. Their primary and only employee is hiring and performance management of the superintendent. And then they set direction and policy with the support of their staff. They are ultimately accountable to the community. So this is in your policy BBA, the roles and responsibilities of the board. The superintendent's role is to manage. So their job is to oversee the day-to-day operations of the district. Their job is to implement the policies or plans that people came to agreement on to make sure that goals that are set by the board are achieved. And ultimately, the superintendent is accountable to the board. Did they meet the goals that the board set forth? Do they meet the expectations that the board set forth? So here's another scenario. Board member comes to meet with the superintendent, and the board member is adamant that the district adopt a new math curriculum. His brother is a teacher in a nearby district and has told the member about the great materials and the curriculum. The member has lots of information about the textbooks and the materials and wants to share it with the whole board to approve it for approval. Is this oversight or overstep? This scenario is also an overstep. The reason for it, again, is we as board members can say that we want high quality math curriculum. We can say that we want our math scores to improve, but when it comes to the specific curriculum that we use, that is up to the administration. That's the how, not the what. And so coming and saying, I want this on the next agenda and I want to approve this. While it's true that the board does approve curriculum, the more appropriate way would be, hey, here's some resources that I got from a neighboring district. If you would like to look them over, you can give them to them as a resource. But when you come as a single board member and say that you want to direct specific curriculum, then you are in the territory of overstepping. Just another visual representation of how this kind of works with the goals at the top. The board is very involved in the adoption of goals for the district and then adoption of policies to support those goals. They then turn over to the administration, who's essential in developing the plans, and of course with input from the board, but then they implement those plans, they monitor their progress, and then they come back and they share the progress with the board, who evaluates the results. So you can see the line there that there's primary responsibility on the top, that is the board. Primary responsibilities on the bottom are the superintendent, but there is a dotted line there, just kind of like the Venn diagram, where there's some overlap or some discussion back and forth, but ultimately the authority lies on either one side or the other. Last little scenario here is, during a board meeting, several members have questions about expenditures in the budget that was approved, including the purchase of new technology for the high school. Board members are curious about the money that was spent, and they want to make sure that teachers are receiving professional development on the new technology, that they know how to use the materials in their classroom. Asking questions about training, is that overstep or oversight?
I think it's oversight.
Yep, this one is oversight. So in this particular situation, while you are asking specifically about how things are being implemented, it's not, it's an oversight because it's the budget. So if you're going to spend money on a technology or a program, it is appropriate to say, okay, did people get trained appropriately on how to use this? And it's appropriate to say, is this working? We bought this. Can you show me that it's being used, or can you show me that we're seeing any growth or improvement based on that? That's all oversight. Where you might get into the overstep territory is if you, for example, were a former IT director and the administration comes to you and says, hey, we did give training, everybody got 4 hours of professional development, and they can call this number if they have questions. And you go, no, I think they need 7 hours, and I think we need to have like pre and post tests on all of this. And if you want to start to get into exactly what kind of PD they should be doing, then you would be getting into the overstep category. But just simply asking to ensure that there was some type of process in place to implement the technology, that in itself is oversight. So the purpose of going through this is that school systems suffer when either, and we're going to get into the effective boards, but when either party tries to overtake the responsibilities of the other. So when the involvement of administration and operation functions distracts our boards from the functioning of the policy development and promotion, it can get a little bit messy. I'll give you an example. There are sometimes districts that we work with, but their superintendent is very particular with how they want to see the district go. And so they may be very direct in terms of, this is what I think the goals should be. This is what I think our strategic plan should be. These are what we're prioritizing. But if the board is not in alignment with that, the superintendent is overstepping. They're overstepping the board and what the board is saying they feel the community wants to prioritize, and that's their role to do as board members. On the flip side, though, if they've set the goal of a priority and the board and the administration comes back with a plan to meet that priority and the board doesn't like it, they can provide feedback, but ultimately you hired these folks to implement. And as long as they have come up with a plan, you can let that plan go. And if you don't like the plan, ultimately it's in the evaluation of the superintendent where that would come out. If you're too busy worrying about every step of implementation and on the day-to-day ins and outs of the district, then there's nobody that's paying attention at the larger level. And so we need both parties to make the system work. We need people focusing on the big picture, and then we need people focusing on the details. And in this relationship, it's the board that focuses on the big picture and the administration that focuses on the details. So to do this, it's important to foster positive relationships. We do a whole other training on team member style and communication protocols with the intent of building trusting relationships that foster collaboration. But here are just a few tips in terms of as you're going forward. There's a couple, there's at least one new member, a couple members that have been together for a few years at least. But what we like to say is anytime you have a new member, you have a new board. And so it's really important that everybody comes together and tries to get on the same page because it's a new team. Anytime you have a change, whether that's an administrative change in terms of the superintendent changing or one board member changing, it changes the dynamic of the team. So having an opportunity to get to know each other is key. But assuming positive intent, assuming that we're all here, I mean, we started with our why, we're all here because we want to help students. So even if we don't agree, we can acknowledge each other's points of view and say, okay, at least I don't understand their position, but I'm going to assume that they have positive intent and work to try to understand that position. Understand that each of you plays an important role and has something to offer. So you, again, are representatives of the community. So make sure that you identify each other's values. Building relationship capital through positive interactions. It's really tough when the only time you see each other is once a month for a meeting and you can't, it's hard to get together and talk because you're afraid of open meeting law violations, but there is still ways to build a relationship. First of all, you can talk to one another about things that are not board related. So just checking in on each other, how each other's doing, families, jobs, things like that is okay. Setting up study sessions where you can get to know each other's points of views on board topics. That's another way to do that. So opportunities like this where you can come and talk about topics is another way to start building those relationships and to creating an opportunity to communicate. So with that, I'm going to go through the 8 characteristics of effective boards. And if you have a piece of paper or something handy, you may want to have that ready because I will give you a little assignment as we're going along. So the 8 characteristics of effective boards is really an important research project and report. There has been over the last couple decades more interest in the effectiveness of boards and the role that they play and how much influence they actually have on student achievement. And so there's been several studies that would look at boards and their actions and then look at the outcomes for their students and try to make correlations. It started with the Lighthouse study and multiple other studies have been replicated. DeVerix and O'Brien basically did a review of all of these various studies, and they came up with, okay, out of all these studies, what are the common things that people continue to find that are contributing to achievement? And what they found is that boards' actions do in fact impact student achievement. So it does matter who's sitting behind the dais, no matter how great, other parts of the system might be, those leaders at the top do have an influence on student achievement. And that if certain characteristics are demonstrated, those boards tend to see better outcomes than when those characteristics are absent. So again, this is a research study, and it's been validated multiple times, and so much so that even the National School Boards Association has centered a lot of their essential work of school boards around these 8 characteristics that we're about to cover. So in NSBA, they call them the key works, and at ASBA, we call them the pillars of service. So basically, what is it that boards should be focusing on? At the center is student achievement. And how do you attain student achievement? You do that through these components around the outside. They're very similar, but we call ours structure, vision, conduct and ethics, accountability, and advocacy. So when I'm going through the 8 characteristics, I'll show you how they tie back to those key pillars of service. The homework part I'm going to ask you is to just think about, as we're going through, write a number 1 and then say, okay, give yourself a check or a minus, whether or not you think that's an opportunity for the board. You can give that a minus, and if you think that's something that the board's doing pretty well, a check. So just to repeat that, if you think that it is going well, you give yourself a check next to the number 1, and if you think it's something that needs improvement, then you can give it the little minus sign or underscore sign. I hate you saying minus sign, but I think most people understand what I mean when I say that. So the first characteristic is effective school boards commit to a vision of high expectations for student achievement and quality instruction, and define clear goals towards that vision. So this ties to our pillar of vision. And what this basically means is, does the board believe that their students can be successful no matter what? Or do they have in their mind a certain level of, okay, well, we know that this amount of kids are going to fail, or we're okay with some kids just are not going to get it? Or do they truly have a vision of high expectations for every student? And do they define their goals and their expectations for their community? The second one is effective school boards have strong shared beliefs and values about what is possible for students and their ability to learn. And the system it has and its ability to teach. So this is similar to the first one, but it is, okay, given that what we have, do we believe that we have influence? So do we have strong values that believe that we have the tools in our system to make influence and positive change for these students? You see there in a quote, achieving districts, in high achieving districts, poverty, lack of parental involvement, and other factors were described as challenges to be overcome and not excuses. So again, tying back to that vision of, we have a vision that all of our schools, all of our students can be successful, and that our system can be successful with them. 3 is that effective school boards are accountability driven. So meaning they spend less time on operational issues or day-to-day issues, and more time focused on the policies that center around student achievement. So high-performing boards focused on establishing a vision, supporting policies that targeted student achievement. Poor governance was characterized by factors such as micromanagement by the board. This ties to the board service pillar of structure. Are we creating the structure to have students and staff be successful? And we do that by making sure that we set up the structure with the policies and the expectations, but we don't get into the weeds. 4, effective school boards have a collaborative relationship with the staff and the community, and they establish strong communication structures to inform and engage both internal and external stakeholders in achieving the district's goals. This has to do with advocacy, because communication is obviously sorry, lost my train of thought. Because communication is one of the key pieces of advocacy and getting folks to get on board and champion the changes or the goals that you're trying to achieve. So when it says that effective school boards have collaborative relationships with staff and community, it also means that and they say structure, it means that they're using appropriate structure. So you all actually have policies on how staff should communicate with community members, with staff, with parents, and you have protocols in place for how that is done. When we do that, we create opportunities for consistency, which is also another word for saying equity, in that we're making sure that everybody has an opportunity to communicate and have their voice heard. So in high achieving districts, school board members could provide specific examples about how they connected to and listened to the community and received information from different sources, including superintendent, directors, principals, and teachers. So this, in a district that is doing this well and a board that's doing this well, they have a structure in place to make sure that they're getting regular feedback from the various stakeholders in their community. Number 5 is that effective boards are data savvy. They embrace and monitor their data even when the information may be negative, and they use it to drive continuous improvement. So this is about accountability. Nobody likes to get a low score. Nobody wants to talk about, where they're struggling. But with districts that were really seeing student achievement, the boards didn't shy away from their data. They used their data as what, like I like to say, a flashlight, not a hammer, meaning they used their data to identify where their opportunities were, where their bright spots were, because there may be some areas in the district that are doing better in a certain area than another. And they use that to drive continuous improvement. They don't try to hide it, but they use that to really identify and track their progress towards growth. Number 6 is that effective school boards align and sustain resources, such as professional development, to meet goals. This is again about structure, and it's about resources and budget. And it's important to point out that resources and budget is not always about dollars, but how we spend our dollars. And the majority of our dollars go towards staff. So our staff invest their time. So our primary resources as a district are people and time. And so when we are looking at our goals, we are saying, are we effectively using our resources, people and time, to meet our goals? And one of the things that they specifically talk about is professional development, because that's one way that you can ensure everybody is on the same page. In the report, they say, to this end, successful boards supported extensive professional development programs for administrators and teachers, even during times of fiscal restraint. 7, effective school boards lead as a united team with the superintendent, each from their respective roles, with strong collaboration and mutual trust. So successful districts boards defined an initial vision for the district and then sought a superintendent who matched this vision. This is conduct and ethics. So this is, again, we say stay in your lane, but that sounds so negative. It's really about ensuring that your duties are fulfilled. And that means that we have to focus on our own duties and not try to overstep and take over the duties of somebody else. And that can be hard to do, especially when, we have experience in a particular area. I'll give you an example. I have a background in children's behavioral health. So I have a lot more questions when we talk about our social workers or our positive behavior programs and all of that. But I have to understand that as much as experience I have on that it's up to our administrative staff, our social workers, to determine how to meet the needs of our students, and that it's not my place to tell them specifically, but I can hold expectations that we're doing something that is meeting the social emotional needs of our students. Finally, 8 is effective school boards take part in team development and training, sometimes with their superintendent, oftentimes with their superintendent, to build shared knowledge, values, and commitments for their improvement efforts. So this is saying high achieving districts had formal and deliberate training for new board members, and they gathered often to discuss specific topics. Low achieving districts had board members who said they did not learn together, except when the superintendent or other staff made presentations of data. So what this is saying is that really effective boards know that it's not going to get done just in that board meeting, that there has to be additional time for the board to come together and work together with the administrative team if they're going to be truly successful. So we don't have worksheets, but I would be interested to hear, give you a minute to kind of reflect. But looking through the 8 characteristics that we just went through, it would be a good activity to highlight maybe one that you think is going really well or that you've seen a lot of progress in, and then one that you think that the board could stand to spend a little bit more time improving.
Nikki, I have a question. Can you
Sure.
hear me now?
I can.
You had said something earlier about the board getting together for study sessions, and you had just mentioned something about them getting together aside from board meetings
Yes.
to discuss anything. So I was kind of under the impression that if we had 3 board members, then we weren't allowed, that was a quorum and we weren't allowed to discuss anything. So can we have board members at our study sessions?
Well, it depends. I think that if the district is having a group or something like that where they're talking about an issue, and I think Chris we'll talk about this a little bit later, but if it is a board committee where the board said, hey, I want you all to talk about this. So I want you, superintendent, the board is directing you to have a session on how we're going to deal with this COVID-19. It would not be advisable to have board members participate in that, because the idea is that you're getting outside perspective and having them come to you with what they found or what their recommendations are. It doesn't mean that you couldn't, but you wouldn't put more than 1 or 2 people on that. And I would really advise against it, because then you're putting board members, and you might have staff members or folks that may not be fully engaged in that process. If they feel like the board member is there, they may be less inclined to be forthcoming.
Okay.
So I would not recommend that.
Nikki?
Go ahead.
Sorry, I mean, I think the way it was used before as, in recommending study sessions, they are meetings of the board. They're meetings that, you have to notice just like you would any other meeting, except that they're not typically regular meetings where you have all that sort of transactional business that you have to do. It's one where, you'd call the board to the meeting to order and just talk about maybe one thing and get different perspectives from it. And the board could discuss it and get presentation from staff. And then, out of that could come some recommendation for action at the next board meeting. But it allows you to sort of dive in deeper into a single topic. So when we say study sessions, we are meaning board meetings that do have to be noticed. It's just a different type of meeting.
Yeah, and that's where I was kind of going, because the question that I heard from Amanda almost sounded like, can we go to those meetings? And that made me think, okay, a superintendent is having those meetings and board members want to go. So that's different. When we talk about study sessions, like Chris said, we're talking about study sessions that the board wants to have to talk about a topic. And then that, like Chris, I mean, you can do that as long as you notice it just like a regular meeting. But if you're talking about other things where the district's already having some kind of meeting and you want to participate, you would not want to include a majority of the board. And if you did, it would become a meeting and you would have had to notice it. The other thing that Chris will talk about when we get into open meeting law is there's a difference between when the superintendent says, hey, I'm going to create this thing to discuss or look into some options for this area. That's different than the board saying, hey, go create a task force and look into this area. Because once the board directs it, it becomes what Chris will call an instrumentality of the board, which means that every time that task force meets or that group meets, they have to follow open meeting law too, whether or not board members are present. So I don't know if that answered or created more questions for you, Amanda.
It's actually Rochelle, and it created more
Rochelle.
questions.
It created more for me too.
All right. So why don't we finish up with this, and then because we're going to go into open meeting law here, and we'll stop as we hit those things again, because the first thing we talk about is what constitutes a meeting. So I think it'll answer a lot of those questions, and I don't want to step on Chris's toes. So let's put a pin in some of those further follow-up questions, and then just go back to the question that I had posed to the group, which is in terms of effective characteristics, what is at least one area where we think we're doing pretty good as a board, and what's one area that you'd like to see us grow in?
Well, I have to say, as the new member, I haven't had a lot of time to really develop opinions on a lot of these 8 points. So it's more difficult for me, I think, to give the strengths and weaknesses of it at this point. I would like to see more opportunities like we're having tonight to develop as a board member, more discussions, more opportunities to talk about how boards operate and how this particular board has operated. Those types of things would be very helpful to me. So I'm grateful for this tonight to be able to do that and like to see more of that.
Thank you, Troy.
It was Steve.
Oh, Steve, see, it's so hard when I don't have pictures.
Well, you have my picture. You can't see me. I'm on.
No, I can't. I just see
Okay. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm okay.
You might be the only one, but yes, thank you. Sorry, Steve.
That's okay.
I agree with Steve as far as I think it's a good idea that we get together and collaborate, learning what the goals are. Our board does a really good job at listening to the community and their needs and wants.
Okay, great. Thank you. Oh, I see you now, Steve. I just had to scroll down.
Okay.
Hey, Troy.
Yeah, go ahead. Can you hear
I
me?
was just wondering what you thought. Yes.
I agree with what Rochelle said and Steve said. Like our team development training, that would be awesome if we could get a lot more of it. I think we need a lot more of it.
Well,
And
the nice thing about us now is we have virtual, so we can make it. We have more opportunities to do that. It doesn't necessarily have to be in person, but we can certainly do in person. We're starting that availability here coming up in May. All right, so I'm going to go to the next slide just and wrap up this section of it because I know that there's a lot of meetings. Open meeting law is hard to wrap our arms around. So just a real quick reminder about policies. Our board policies are the law of the land for the district. So those are the rules that we should be following and abiding. And it's especially true for board members. You all approved these policies, or they might have been approved before your time. Ideally, we recommend that boards are reviewing these policies periodically to make sure that they're still in line with what they're doing. A lot of times these policies and practices will sit on the shelf once they're approved, and over time practices will change, and what you're doing isn't in line with what you say you're going to do, and that causes problems. So one of the primary responsibilities of boards is policy. So we recommend policy reviews. Our team does policy reviews, or you could do them yourselves, which is what our district recently did, or actually a couple years ago. It took us 2 years, but we would every board meeting go through a section of our policies so that we could review them and update them if needed. It took 2 full years to get through our entire policy manual. You can do that process with our policy team in less time, and then just have the board ratify any changes that come up. But I say that to say that you have policies in your policy manual that tell you exactly what boards should be doing. So B is for board. So the B policies in your policy manual talk all about the board, what its responsibilities are, talks about the organizational meeting, talks about rules of order for your board meetings, talks about what communication protocols are appropriate for communicating with the public. And so I would recommend, while you're really responsible for upholding all the policies, nobody's expecting you as board members to memorize like the 1,000+ pages. But some tips that I've given other boards is to start to integrate policy into your regular meetings. And what I mean by that is when you have an agenda item on the agenda, having the board admin tie to it any relevant policy. So if you're approving transportation for a field trip or something like that, attaching the policies that have to do with transportation and field trips to that. That way boards can be given a particular time. Another Cliff Notes version I encourage board members to look at or to go to the B policies, because your board And then also go to your K policies, because K policies have a lot of your communication chain of command policies, like who should you go to if you have a complaint or a concern. And that's one of the things that I think trip up board members and ask questions about something that's going on at the schools. There's a protocol and a policy in place for that, and it's important that board members follow it. Any questions about policy? The last thing I will say there is that the policies that, assuming that you all use our model policies, these policies are based on law. So ASBA didn't just decide these are what we want you to have. It's what is required by law. Let us create a policy that will keep you compliant. And so we put a copyright on that. They're compliance driven. The board is able to change those policies if they want to, but keep in mind, you'll want to run that through your legal counsel, because you don't want to make any types of changes that are going to make your policy not compliant with law. But you can alter the language to policies. And then once you adopt the policy to approve it, it's your policy. So you can't say, oh, I don't know, that's ASBA's policy. Once you've adopted it in your policy manual, it's your policy. And so you're responsible as board members for upholding it. And here's just a couple of those highlighted board policies that are in B. So kind of a sneak peek of where you can get that. If you don't know where to access your policies, you should talk to your superintendent. They should be able to access it for you. If they don't have a paper version, we also have a link to what's called Policy Bridge on the AZSBA. And you can look up your district. You can also look at any other districts. So if you're curious about what other districts have in terms of their policy for certain things, you can look up their policies as well. And then the code of ethics, this is a big one. BCA is our code of ethics. And the key is that these are agreements. These are kind of an honor code of ethics. One thing about school board service is that unless they do something that's a felony and makes them ineligible to hold office, or they move out of bounds, or they get recalled, which is a very expensive and timely process, you really can't get rid of a board member because they are being unethical. So it's really up to ourselves to police ourselves and to try to handle issues and educate ourselves and our fellow board members as to what are the expectations that we have as a board, as a team, and what are the ethics and agreements that we're going to live by. And so that's why it's so important to review those code of ethics in their boardrooms, to remind themselves of what their responsibilities are as a person that's entrusted with making decisions for their students and families. We do have a board self-evaluation. So if you come to a point where you are interested in seeing maybe where you have a training need, I find that this board self-evaluation tool has helped the boards that we've worked with. One of your policies does say that you'll do an annual board self-evaluation. It says May. So if you haven't been doing it, you're not in trouble, but you do have a policy that says boards may do an annual self-evaluation. And this is for the board itself. This is not an evaluation of the superintendent or the district. It's an evaluation of the board's work over the course of a year. And they are centered before, and it basically asks each board member how are we each of these things in each of the 5 categories. And what I've seen with the boards that we've worked with is when we look at the questions that are correlated to conduct and ethics, vision, highlight areas where they need help. They either need additional training, or they need to create a process for something, or they need to come to an agreement on something. But the board self-evaluation is a great tool to identify the needs of the board, and also opportunities for the administration to understand where they may need to provide more feedback or resources. So I just put that out there as something as you continue to think about what can help you develop as a board. the board self-evaluation is out there. It's pretty inexpensive. It's online in minutes to complete. And then we come up with a generated report that will say, okay, this percentage of the board members strongly agreed that this was an area of pride or things that you're doing well. And, you know, half the board thinks that we're not doing this well. And that might be something that we want to look into. So it's a very detailed report that's available and really useful for boards that have used it. So with that, I'm right around my hour mark, a little less. We started a little bit late, but I want to give us as much time as possible to go through the meeting, all your questions answered there. So we're going to take a quick 5-minute break while we switch over the decks. So stretch your legs, get some water, and we will be back at 5:36 to start with open meeting law. And I am going to continue to stream this live. So those that may be watching live, we will be back in 5 minutes. Chris, do you have this deck on your computer?
I don't know if I do or not.
Let me email this to you real quick and let you open it up and share your screen, because that way you have full control. If I just let you control my screen, anytime I move my mouse, I take back control, and that would keeps me from being able to check the chat and all of that.
Okay.
So let me email that to you right now. And then just let me know when you have it opened up and on presenter screen, and I'll walk you through how to share if you need help with that.
Can you see it?
Yeah, I can see it.
I think it's, I've got to use the OneDrive version because I don't have an updated PowerPoint on my computer. So I've got to
Okay,
use that. So sometimes there's a delay in advancing it, but
okay. Well, I can see it. It looks good. And you're in control right now.
okay.
So I'm gonna just monitor the chat. So I will let you know if there's any questions.
Okay.
I'm gonna mute myself though.
Chris, I have to ask you about your background.
Which
I
one?
have, I have not been able to get a virtual background where I don't completely blend. You have one that even when you move, it seems like you don't disappear into the background. You must
Yeah.
have the pro version of the background. Huh?
I don't know. Honestly, about a year ago, first day, I was like, I don't want to see. I want everybody to see my, that I'm not, I don't. My room needs cleaned or whatever, So, I got to come up with something, and then I was like, I'm going to go outside and take a picture. So, I did, and there it is.
Well, the thing is, you're not blending into it as you move. Everyone I've used, I either lose a shoulder or lose the back of my head or something, and.
Yeah, you got to watch that. That sometimes you get, I have things that I put in the background, and I'll look like I have horns or something. So
Right.
gotta take those off.
And that one's working out fine.
Yeah. Okay, I've got 536. Is everybody back?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
The open meeting law. Every open meeting law. Hello. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the open meeting law, kind of cover everything that's in the statutes. It's kind of a short part of the law. There's only 8 sections of statute, but it is also at the same time, very dense. So what I've done is essentially, in all my open meeting law presentations for the entire time I've been at ASBA, 21 years, as general counsel over 20 years, I've used some version of this PowerPoint, which I think is, simple. It tries to divide it into, 12 rules that if you have a good understanding of, you have a good understanding of the open meeting law. So as always, I'm happy to take questions. And the easiest thing to do is, of course, to take them as we go. But I know in a virtual format, sometimes that doesn't work very well. So we can just go straight through them. If you want to sort of, make a mental note and ask them at the end, that's fine too. So, all right, let's get started. The first rule is a pretty simple one, you need to know why the law exists, what the purpose of the law is. And it's, the legislature has decided that the law will favor openness in government, and that the citizens have a right to see the decisions and the deliberations of the public bodies of the state and to decide for themselves whether or not they're being well served by that, by those meetings. So we have, a couple of sunshine laws. One is the open meeting law. The other one is the public records law. And they both are intended to bring the public into the decision-making process. If not to be involved in the process, to at least see their representatives that they have elected, or who are representing them, and making sure that everything is being done consistent with the law and with their public charge. We'd like to say this is a public trust law, which means that it's one of those laws that if the public perceives that you're not taking it seriously, it makes it very difficult for you to do your decision, because they think that very, very difficult for you to operate, because they assume that you're not doing following the law, you're not bringing them into the process, and something untoward is happening. Also understand that the law concerns itself with protecting the public interest. It does not concern itself with the interest of board members or school districts or school employees particularly. It really exists for the public. And there may be times that in applying the law, you'll say, well, this doesn't make sense, or this doesn't make it easy for us to do our jobs. And that's, exactly the point. The point is, it's there to serve the public. And we need to remember that at every meeting we have, whether there's anybody that attend or not, and I'll bet that some of your meetings may not have members of the public there at all. Many, large districts are like that too. But you need to know that the public is always there in spirit. And of course, right now they're watching us on YouTube, so they are there and are able to see your meeting because of the open meeting law. So the second rule is that to know when the open meeting law applies, and we do something kind of interesting in this state and in how we craft the application of when the open meeting law applies, which is that we define what a meeting is. And we define a meeting as any time a quorum of board members get together and talk about something that's within their jurisdiction. And so if that happens and we have not called a meeting and we do not have an agenda, or we haven't followed all the other things of the open meeting law, what we have is an illegal meeting, but it is a meeting nonetheless. So breaking it down, it requires a quorum, and a quorum is essentially a majority of your board. It also applies to an instrumentality of the board. And what that means is that's just a fancy legal word for a subcommittee. And a subcommittee is created if the board on motion creates a subcommittee, or if through policy they create a subcommittee, or if they direct the superintendent to create a subcommittee. All of any of those actions could create a subcommittee, and then that subcommittee has to follow the open meeting law as well. And you could obviously understand why that would be, because if that were not the case, any really tough decision or one that you wanted to make without public scrutiny, you could appoint a subcommittee to make that decision, and that subcommittee could do it outside of public view and really not be able to observe the process being done. So know that when you create a subcommittee, that they also have to follow the open meeting law. And then a quorum is a majority of the board, and it doesn't matter if the quorum is constituted physically, 3 board members at the same place at the same time, or like this, where we're on a virtual call, where we've got 3 board members that are there participating through technological means. And so we also have account for a quorum and also have to follow the open meeting law. There's a specific prohibition on voting by proxy. So if, say, you couldn't attend a meeting, you couldn't, give your vote to another board member to enter in. You actually have to be part of the meeting. And you can also trigger the open meeting law by, again, not having physical proximity. And we talked again about, through technological means, through a virtual meeting, but you may not also be, you may trigger a meeting even when you're not engaging at the exact same time. For instance, an email chain or a phone call chain through a serial conversations by a quorum of board members could also meet the quorum requirements of the open meeting law. And we'll get into that a little bit later in more detail. But a quorum alone is not enough to violate the open meeting law. If a quorum of board members got together and talked about, each other's kids, that's not a violation of the open meeting law unless they're talking about their kids in the school and something that they could have some effect on. Again, the second part of what a meeting is that you also have to be dealing with some aspect of the school district where you discuss or propose to take legal action or deliberate with respect to any legal action. And legal action is construed very broadly under the open meeting law. It's basically anything that the district could deal with if they wanted to. It's not just what's on the next agenda. It's anything that could be on an agenda. So keep that in mind as well. A meeting also includes a one-way electronic communication by one board member of the public body that proposes legal action to a quorum of board members. So if, as we mentioned before, you have an email chain where, say, the superintendent has sent some information out to the entire board, and one board member responds, replying all to all board members, including the superintendent, that was great information. I propose that we do X about that information. Well, that proposal to a quorum of board members, even if the other board members don't respond, is a violation of the open meeting law, because a proposal for legal action by any one board member to a quorum of board members is a violation of the open meeting law. And then obviously the issue in the same kind of situation, when you have an email, if there's discussion about the topic, even if you're going to, make that decision and ultimate deliberation about the decision in an open session in the future, any discussion that's by that quorum over electronic communications triggers the quorum requirement of the open meeting law. So you want to be aware of that too. So there are some things to do that you can do to avoid that. Superintendents, if you want to get information out to board members, we recommend that if you send an email out to board members, that you put the board member addresses on the blind copy, and that you put in the body of the email that it's to all board members. That way, if some board member, responds with a question or a discussion, and they reply all, the reply is just going to go back to you. It's not going to go to all the other board members. So that's kind of a trick to sort of avoid that. Another thing is all the electronic communications, emails ought to have the tagline disclaimer to say that, discussion amongst the quorum of the board is a violation of the open meeting law. For this reason, we should not discuss amongst a quorum or forward or, propose legal action. So
Can I say something on that real quick?
Sure.
It is important that forwarding piece as well, because I've seen that situation where two board members had a conversation and one of those board members forwarded that conversation to a third person. And it was a violation of open meeting law, but the one person didn't even know that they were engaged in it, in a violation. As far as they knew, it was a one-on-one conversation, but this other board member shared it with somebody else, making it a meeting. So it's just really important to be careful with sharing those pieces of information. It's the same with when we meet with our teachers association as board members. We used to meet with them, and they would have a series of questions that they would ask all of us. And those representatives would go back and talk about what their board member said. Well, essentially those people were having a meeting without us. They were sharing each of our answers with each other. And so we had to change the way that we were meeting with them, because they were able to know what all the other board members thought before even the board members themselves, because we hadn't had a meeting to have that conversation in public. So it can be really tricky. I did want to take a break here to give anybody an opportunity. I am monitoring the chat. So if you have a question, just put "I have a question" in the chat, and I will make a pause if I can when Chris gets those kind of lulls.
Okay. So you can also violate the open meeting law, and this is similar to what we've talked about before, with a series of one-on-one discussions that lead to an agreement among a quorum of board members. And how it goes is, you have a board member A approaches board member B about an issue that they're seeing in the district. And then board member B approaches board member C about that same issue and relays the earlier conversation that they had. What you've done is strung together a quorum of board members. They may not be at the same place at the same time, but you've essentially had a discussion outside of a public meeting. So that would violate the open meeting law. So what you need to do, you still can, one board member can still talk to another board member, but you need to, both of those board members need to make a mental note that they cannot have a similar conversation with a third board member, because that will be a violation of the open meeting law. In addition, superintendents can serve as information hubs for management decisions and about, information getting out to the board. But the superintendent is not allowed to essentially secure approval for something, outside of a public meeting. So in other words, why we encourage, as a great management tool, superintendents meeting with individual board members as ones or twos, and talking about, things that are happening in the district, sharing information. What the superintendent shouldn't do, or what even board members should not do through the superintendent, is have a discussion where you're talking about other board members' positions or polling the board before moving forward with the decision. That's also a violation of the open meeting law. So again, this is just the same thing. Governing board members can't direct staff to communicate with other board members if that communication itself would have violated the open meeting law. It's a violation for the board members to engage in that. It's a violation for the staff members to engage in that. So a couple tips in this area of Rule 2 is that, remember that it applies to all meetings of the board. And we talked about study sessions before. You'll also have, things like retreats, or what other kinds of things. Obviously, executive sessions. There's different names that we call different types of meetings on school districts and school boards. Just understand, for the purposes of the open meeting law, if you have a meeting, you have a quorum, talking about board business, it doesn't matter what you call your meeting, the open meeting law applies. Okay. Because I've had that before where, oh no, we really didn't have much of an agenda because it was a study session. We weren't going to decide anything. So yeah, we talked about a lot of things, but we really didn't have an agenda that we followed because we weren't deciding anything. Well, that's not what's required of the open meeting law. Even if you're having a study session, you have to have an agenda, and you have to list on that agenda specifically what you're going to talk about. So remember that subcommittees can be created on motion of the board or the presiding officer if they have that authority. And remember, it's not just about something that's on the next agenda. It's anything that could come before the board in terms of subject matter. When I say watch the parking lot, and I know you live in a small community, so you're running into each other all the time, on the golf course, in your jobs, at the grocery store. Just remember that, yes, you're going to talk, but you can't talk as a quorum about board business. And you want to try to avoid, certain situations where people will imply a violation of the open meeting law, but there is not one going on, because again, a majority of you can be together, and as long as you're not talking about board business, everything is fine. So, okay, let's get to the third rule, which is basically, all the logistical requirements that the open meeting law has for your meetings, which are, the location of your meeting, the notice that you're going to have a meeting, the agenda of what's going to be discussed at that meeting, and then the minutes of essentially memorializing what happened at that meeting. So taking these one at a time, the location. So your regular meeting should be in a public facility in the district. It should be, a space that is accessible to the public, including the disabled, and should be adequate for the public to attend and to listen. You can have special meetings in different spaces. I know you have two schools. Sometimes we have in smaller communities where you have just a few schools. You can have a meeting off district premises at a particular school location. Or if you're going to be getting a really large attendance, you can move it to multi-purpose room at a school to allow for greater attendance. All of those are okay. You just need to make sure that everything works. Like people can hear you, that it's being recorded, and you can pick up all the sounds that you need to pick up so to do the minutes. All those kind of things. You can also have special meetings off district premises, but you can't take legal action unless you're at the public facility in a public facility in the district. So we have a number of districts that do retreats. They'll go up to Flagstaff or something like that in the summer, get out of the heat. But they understand that essentially it's a big work study. There's no legal action taken, and the public is invited to attend and can attend if they choose to. Your notice is basically, there's two requirements for your notice. One is the requirement to put on your website where your notices will be posted when you're going to have a meeting. That includes your website. It also includes some physical location in the district. Typically, it's at the district office. It's under glass. Ideally, it's someplace that the public can see even when the building is closed. And that's the first notice requirement. The second notice requirement is when you're actually going to be having a meeting, posting that notice of that meeting at least 24 hours in advance, and then delivering written notice to board members at least 24 hours in advance. Then the law asks that you inform the public in a manner that's reasonable and practicable, which is encouraging you to post your agenda and your notice in other locations. But what we want to make sure we don't do is make that part of your official notice, because the more places you say we're going to post in these 10 locations, and if you miss one, then you have defective notice and it's an illegal meeting. So our recommendation is to keep your notice that you post on your website simple, your website and one physical location in the district. If you want to post in other places, that's fine, but don't make that part of your official notice. The agenda is posted with the notice. This is what you're going to talk about at the meeting, and the agenda has to list specific items that will be addressed at that meeting, what will be discussed, considered, or decided. And know that if you say on the agenda that you're going to just discuss something or it's for information only, then you're limited to actually taking action on that item at the agenda, because you put the public on notice that you are not going to take action. Okay. Now that's not the same as if you say these are action items. You can always not take action, something that has been noticed for action, but you can't take action on something that has been noticed that you're not going to take action on. So take that under consideration if you split out your agenda as far as action items and information items. Then your agenda has to list specifically on the items that are going to be discussed, and they have to be described in a manner that the public can understand. That somebody who doesn't even follow your school district, or just the person off the street, so that they can read the agenda, understand the agenda, and then based on that written agenda, decide whether or not they want to attend that meeting or not. Excuse me. Because you're limited to those items that appear on the agenda and matters that are directly related to those agenda items. So it's really important that that agenda be well written and very consistent with people understanding that. So you want to avoid things like legal jargon, educationese, acronyms that most people wouldn't understand, that kind of thing. And then we'll talk about executive session agendas when we get there. So minutes, you have to have minutes, either written minutes or recording of your sessions, including your executive sessions. And your minutes have to contain the following elements. The date, time, and place the meeting took place, what members were present or absent, a general description of everything that was considered, and then a description of every legal action that was proposed, including who made motion, who seconded the motion, and then what the vote was. And then the names of persons who made statements or presented materials to the board. There is no requirement under the open meeting law to approve your minutes. Minutes are open to public inspection, and they have to be open to public inspection 3 days, at least after 3 working days. and you have to keep a recording of the minutes if you transfer them to written form at least 6 months under the public records retention guidelines. And then your executive session minutes we'll talk about in a little bit. So that's our third role. Any questions so far? Okay.
Yes, Steve has a question.
Okay.
Yeah, I do. And you may be covering this, Chris, coming up, but I'll ask it and then tell me if you're going to be covering it. On the agenda items, if a person rises to talk and they are talking about something on the agenda item and they raise another item that relates to the agenda item, can that item then become a point of discussion if it relates to the agenda item, if it specifically relates to it, or is that considered another item and should not be discussed by the board?
Well, the law allows for you to talk about any item, what's on the agenda and items that are related to those agenda items. So what I would want to make sure, though, is that it's very closely related and understanding that that's a fairly short leash. And what you want to avoid is when, you kind of leapfrog over, a couple of things that where there's a more tenuous connection to the stated agenda item. But, if somebody made the discussion was, bus routes, and somebody said, well, the bus routes are what they are to save gas. And, we spent this much money on gas last year. And that's why this is important. That would be an item that's directly related. That would be fine. Okay. Whereas, if somebody said, well, I want to talk about the bus drivers and how we can't keep them and whether or not we're paying enough because, we'd be able to have, different bus routes if we had more drivers. Now you're really on something that's kind of not related. That's a more tenuous sort of connection. So even trying to tie it back, I think it makes it difficult. But so that's kind of my example of where you really do, you can talk about an item that's directly related to an agenda item as stated, but you've got a really short leash.
Okay. So it would just be limited though to discussion of that item. There could be no action on that specific, on that alternative item.
Right. Absolutely. That's
Okay.
right. You can discuss it, but obviously you can't take action unless the item, itself is stated on the agenda that way. Okay.
And just a follow-up question on that too. If someone has asked to talk and they're speaking on an agenda item, is it common practice for the board to be able to ask questions of that person, or is that typically not done?
Well, it's typically not done. Are you talking about members of the public?
Right.
Okay. It's typically not done because other than clarifying questions, and again, assuming that you're talking about something that's, if they're speaking to an item on the agenda.
Right.
If they make a statement or, there's in understanding their statement, you need to have additional information. If you ask for additional information from the dais, that would not be a problem.
Okay.
We want to try to avoid, and this is not an open meeting law issue, this is more of a sort of a meeting protocol issue, is having a back and forth dialogue with members of the public, because we like to say that these are meetings that are in the public, but they're not meetings of the public.
Okay.
What we ought to make sure that the public has their say and has their input, but that they're not, part of the meeting in the same way the board members are.
But if you're asking for clarification, that's typically okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And remember, just keep in mind, that's for things on the agenda, not on
Right.
things that are not on the agenda. Bit different rules there.
And Chris, there's usually protocol with that. So for example, and you're going to go into that, but anybody that's going to address the board needs to be written into the minutes. So it should be more formalized where if a person asked to speak, they filled out your process, they came and they spoke. If a board member had a follow-up question to somebody that came to the dais, they would then have to come back to the dais and address it. It wouldn't be just like shouted out from the audience. There should be
Right.
some protocol or decorum around that.
Absolutely. Yeah, you should, I mean, only when they're at when they're, come to the lectern should they be discussing or having questions given to them.
Okay. Okay.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Sure. So, also, our fourth rule is essentially following basic procedural rules, which is that there's, sort of a beginning, middle, and end of your meetings, that you formally call your meeting to order, that you follow all your board policies, and then you cover all the items on the agenda. Now, I noticed today that you approved your agenda. Believe it or not, many districts don't do that as a matter of routine, or they gloss over that and not understand the significance of that. When you adopt your agenda, and while it may seem like a formality, that is your opportunity to move things in the the order of things. For instance, if you have 10 people show up on an item that you did not think was going to be controversial, and it's item 15, why not why make them wait until that time? So when you adopt your agenda, you could say, I move that we adopt the agenda with the following change, that item 15 be moved up to item 4. And then you adopt the agenda that way. That gives the public greater notice what you're going to be doing in terms of your order of your agenda. And you can do that unless you've said on the agenda that we're going to deal with this item at this time, something that we do not recommend that you do, because if you do that and it turns out that you're running ahead and somebody shows up at 7 o'clock and they thought you're going to have that discussion at 7 o'clock and you've already blown past that, well, they can rightfully claim an open meeting law violation because they showed up at the time that you've said you're going to talk about it. You can always table items without discussion. Obviously, you can cover only those items that are on the agenda. You require speakers to identify themselves, and then you formally adjourn your meeting. So what are citizens' rights under the open meeting law? Citizens have the right to attend and to record public meetings, but they don't have a right to participate in discussions unless your public participation policy allows for it, okay? So that's kind of an interesting point, because when a lot of folks hear about the open meeting law for the first time, they assume that it requires public participation, and it does not. And but the good thing is, because it does not, most districts do have a public participation policy, and they have flexibility to create a policy that works for them. Under the open meeting law, the public does have the right to attend and to listen. They have the right to record you. They have the right to expect you to follow your own rules. And then they have the right to address the public body if your policy allows for it. Otherwise, there's no right to participate. Our next rule is the governing board has the authority to conduct an open call to the public. What is an open call to the public? An open call to the public is where the public is invited to not only make comments about items that appear on that night's agenda, but any item that is within the jurisdiction of the board, whether it's on the agenda or not. What you need to understand is that if somebody raises something on the open call to the public, there are different rules that apply. First of all, you cannot engage the speaker in discussion. You cannot ask clarifying questions. You can only ask the staff to review the matter or place it on a future agenda, or respond to criticism at the conclusion of the call to the public by those that have addressed the board. So one of your options is, and again, I said you had flexibility about how your public participation policy is. You have the flexibility to say, we're going to have a limited call to the public, so that anybody can speak on items that appear on the agenda, but we're not going to allow for comments on items that do not appear on the agenda. There are some districts in the state that do that. Most boards, though, do have an open call to the public where you can raise an issue that's on the night's agenda, or something that is not on the agenda as well. Again, just understanding what the rules will be. I think what's really important in this instance is if somebody does raise an issue that's not on the agenda, that the person that took the time to come to speak to you understand that while you'd love to be responsive to them, you do not have the authority to engage on that issue because it's not on that night's agenda.
Chris, I have a question.
Sure.
Okay, so one of the issues that we had is people do a call to the public, and the statement is read by the board president or whoever's running the meeting. So is a board member allowed to ask clarification if a person makes a statement? Can a board member ask clarification of that person who makes a statement?
If the item is not on the agenda, I don't believe you can.
If it's somewhat on the agenda.
If it's on the agenda, yes, you can. Legally,
Okay.
you can.
Okay.
So again, because you have flexibility and the kind of, of what the policy is going to be, you can adopt what we call reasonable time, place, and manner regulations, which are allowed under the First Amendment, because that's one of the things you've done here is by creating a space for the public to comment, you've created essentially a First Amendment zone where those are allowed, individuals are allowed to express themselves. But you can say, yes, you can express yourself for 2 minutes, or you can express yourself for 3 minutes, whatever your restriction is. And you can also say that you can express yourself so long as it's not, abusive or obscene or something like that. But what you cannot do is block a comment because you don't like its content or its viewpoint. That's protected under the First Amendment to the Constitution. So keep that in mind. But, reasonable time, place, and manner regulations are fine. But what's important in this area is that whatever policy you've adopted is sufficiently communicated and that it's consistently applied, so that you're not sort of like, oh yeah, we normally don't have a time limit, but because there's a lot of people showing up today, we're going to have 3 minutes a person. You don't want to do that. You want to make sure that it's consistently applied no matter what.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there too, that this is an equity issue as well. So understanding that not everybody will do call to the public. And so, you want to make sure that you're following the policies consistently for at least those that do. So not only like what Chris was saying in terms of, oh, I don't like what you're saying, so I'm going to really hold you to that 3 minutes. Oh, I like what you're saying, so I'm going to let you go past that 3 minutes. But beyond that, if you have a procedure, which you probably do have a policy that says, okay, everybody that's going to do a call to the public, whether it's on an agenda or an item or not, they're going to fill out this card because we have to, for the minutes, have your name. And we want to know what you're going to talk about. If that's your procedure, but then you allow people to just get up without filling out those cards or to speak out of turn and not from the dais, you're not being consistent. And it begins to tell the people that are following the practice, well, why should I follow this practice if other people are not?
That was one of the issues that we had. I had somebody come up to me after the board meeting and say, why do some people have to fill it out to speak and others can just talk randomly?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, it is, you want to say, here's the rules, they're clearly communicated, and then we're going to apply them each and every time without regard to whether we like what the person's saying or whether we don't like what the person's saying. Okay. So our seventh rule is that there is a provision in the open meeting law that allows a superintendent or any board member to give a summary of current events without specifically listing on the agenda what it is they're going to talk about. It's an exception to the general rule that the agenda has to list everything on it that you're going to talk about. But there are special rules that come with this provision, which is that, one, the fact that, a summary of current events will be given is on the agenda, and that if and that the public body and any member of the public body does not discuss or take legal action on any matter that's not specifically identified on the agenda. The typical typical board report or superintendent report where it's not on the agenda are usually status reports on things like, we want to recognize our librarian who just hit 10 years. We value her service. We want to recognize our volleyball team that just went to the state playoffs and represented us well. Those kind of things that are not typically discussion issues for the whole board. It's sort of more shout outs and recognitions. And for the board perspective, it's like, I attended an ASBA training. I found it valuable, and I've got information if any of other members of the board want to get it, or I attended this particular athletic event, and I thought that the kids worked really hard and they've made a lot of progress, and I just want to acknowledge the coaches and all the parents involved. That kind of thing is the proper subject matter for what this carve out is. It's not intended to be a place where there's a substantive conversation that needs to take place on things that are kind of weighty in the district. For those kind of items, you want to make sure that those items are on the agenda, because say the superintendent raises an issue in the superintendent report, that's not on the agenda. The members of the public body, the member of the board are not allowed to ask questions, even clarifying questions. All they can do is say, can we get this on a future agenda, or could I get additional information about that? That's all they really can do. So, no discussion, and only board members or superintendents can do this. So in other words, if you have other kinds of reports, and I know you have, two schools and maybe, you have two principals who normally come to your meetings and give reports, those reports have got to actually be on the agenda. So, if one of those principals is giving a report, it's got to say principal report, and the items, the topics that will be discussed need to be bulleted underneath, that individual's report. Same thing with transportation or business report or, budget report, any of those kind of things. You actually have to list the subtopics that you're going to talk about on the agenda. Okay, so, and that kind of talks about that. So, all right, so we're going to jump into executive sessions now, because this is an area that where you get a lot of questions. And this is an executive session by definition is a gathering or quorum of members of a public body from which the public has been excluded. And why have they been excluded? Because the legislature has decided that the public interest is better served that the public not be there. Now that may sound counterintuitive, but when we get into why some of these authorized reasons, you'll understand. And by the way, it's not 7 authorized reasons, it's 9 authorized reasons. We added 2 last year, so I need to update that. But that you also have to, follow all the procedures that are required to have an executive session. So procedural requirements before you have an executive session. First, you have to call the meeting to order before you go into an executive session. You need to think of an executive session as sort of a meeting within a meeting. So you put on the agenda, the board may go into an executive session, and we're going to go into executive session for this specific reason. And you have to provide the statutory authority for that reason. And then the board has to motion, somebody has to make a motion to go into executive session, and that motion has to be supported by a majority of those that are present. So all of those things are required before you can get there to an executive session. During the executive session, only those individuals who have a role to play in that executive session should be there. Who is that? Well, typically that is the superintendent and the board members, and any other individual that has some role to play. The board, by policy and by practice, can decide who those individuals are going to be. sometimes, it's common for many board members to have, many public bodies to have their business manager there, or to have their board secretary for the purposes of taking minutes. All allowed, but not necessarily required. And each individual who is at that executive session has to be reminded each and every time that what happens in the executive session is confidential and cannot be disclosed to anyone at any time. And then you cannot take a preliminary vote or a straw poll in an executive session, just prior to deciding the matter in open session. So if you're having an executive session that leads to a vote, say you're doing an executive session for a superintendent evaluation, and you've, sort of going around the room, and you think you have consensus about, everything this evaluation is going to have in it. But before doing that, you then go around the room saying, I need to know if you all are going to vote for this evaluation when we adopt it, when we go to open session. If you do that, you're doing a straw poll and a preliminary vote, and that's a violation of the open meeting law. So after the executive session, again, the final vote has to take place in open session. However, there are 3 areas where the board can direct or instruct a third party without actually, having to take this action in open session. One is if you're involved in litigation or settlement discussions, if you're involved in negotiations with your employee organizations, or for negotiations for relating to real estate. And then you have to continue with the remainder of your meeting after your executive session concludes. So the 9 authorized reasons, see, I have it right here, are the following. 1, to discuss certain employee matters, to get legal advice from your lawyer, to discuss records that are exempt from public inspection. And they could be, or, they have to be confidential by a matter of contract or by state or federal law. If you're going to be involved in contract negotiations or pending litigation or settlement discussions, if you're giving instruction to a negotiating representative on your behalf, if you were involved in international or interstate negotiations. Sometimes happens if you have nearby tribal lands, or, that does happen in this state. Purchase, sale, or lease of real property, as we mentioned before. And then the 2 items that were added last year, discussion of school safety operations plans or programs, and security plans or systems. And those 2 things, the security, school safety operations, this is really, if you're going to be talking about evacuation plans for schools, fire drills, emergency drills, heaven forbid, active shooter plans, if to prepare for something like that. You wouldn't want to have that discussion in an open session and divulge what would be, highly sensitive information. And that's why the legislature agreed that you could talk about that in an executive session. A couple notes about the most common executive sessions that school districts have. One is employee matters, that you have to be discussing an employee and not a position. So that means a real person. You have to be talking about Principal X. You can't be talking about eliminating the position of, dropping the number of custodians that serve your district from 4 to 3. That's a, kind of a more of a general personnel matter that should be talked about in executive session, or in open session rather. If you are talking about an identified employee, you have to deliver written notice to that employee at least 24 hours in advance, and then the employee can decide that they want to have that discussion in public. The employee has no right to attend the executive session, however, unless it's to conduct a due process hearing, and that's only after the advice of your counsel to do so. You can invite an employee to attend, but again, I would ask your counsel whether or not that's a good idea. The employee has no right to they do have the right to review the minutes of the executive session for the portion that they were discussed. Superintendent evaluations, if you're going to have a superintendent evaluation, that can also be a personnel related executive session, but remember that it should be related to that individual's personal performance and not involve this extended conversation about district goals and program, goals and attainment of those goals. Those should be an open session. But this individual's, personal performance can be discussed in executive session. Legal advice, your attorney has to be present or, on the phone, and the discussion needs to be directed through the lawyer, questions posed to that individual. But once that legal advice has been rendered, the purpose, unless you're, been noticed for an additional reason to have the executive session, that executive session needs to end. If you're going to have discussions with a negotiating representative, if you do meet and confer, just make sure that you're really focusing on giving that direction and you're not having broader discussions about different programs or budget issues that need to happen in open session. You have to have executive session minutes, and they have to contain the date, time, and location, who was there, a general description of everything that was considered, including an accurate description of any instructions that were given. And then your executive session minutes are confidential. They are limited to public body members, the employee that was subject to the discussion, or if there's some sort of law enforcement action or audit. Okay. Our ninth rule, we're getting down to the last few rules here. If you're having a student hearing on, promotion and retention, know that generally speaking, student discipline or retention issues of students are exempt from the open meeting law. So in those 9 authorized reasons, you did not see student discipline. And that's because it's not in the open meeting law. It's found in Title 15, but the Title 15 still directs these sessions be an executive session, but the reason's different. It's not for some public interest. It's because of the privacy interests of the student and the parents. And so you need to think of them a little bit differently than the other types of sessions. Really, it's about protecting the privacy interests of the student. And here, if there's a hearing and decision about the retention or promotion issue, the parent, it's an executive session unless the parent requests a public meeting, or if the student is 18, the student can request a public meeting. And then if it's heard in an executive session, the teacher has to be informed, and they have the right to attend that executive session as well. If you're dealing with a student disciplinary matter, and really, it's only the most serious student disciplinary matters that the board deals with. Typically, the board a hearing officer will hear the case if you're looking to expel a student, or long time suspend them, but usually we're talking about expulsions. You get it. The hearing officer hears the evidence, they make recommendation to the board, and then the board hears that recommendation in executive session unless the parent wants it in open session. If it's an executive session, the parent then has a right to attend and to record the proceeding and review the minutes. But the hearing officer, if the hearing officer is going to be doing the procedure as well, that's also private. So it's not a matter for public consumption. Our 10th rule is that the board has the authority to meet in an emergency session if circumstances warrant less than 24-hour notice. This has to be something that it was unexpected. It's not an unexpected event if somebody's going to leave town and you're going to lose a quorum. It isn't last year we had several emergency sessions of the board where the board had to take action with the closing of schools and going to virtual learning. If you have an emergency session, you have to discuss, the details of the emergency at the meeting. You have to post your notice and agenda as soon as you can, and put the details of the minute in the minutes as well. And just make sure you create a record of why you weren't able to comply with the normal 24-hour notice requirement. Legal action taken in violation of the open meeting law is void. So, if somebody alleges that you violated the open meeting law, you took action on an item that wasn't properly noticed, what happens is you effectively have, it's as though the board didn't actually approve that item. it's invalid. But the board can redo that item and redo it in the right way if they take action within 30 days after they became aware of a violation. So if somebody alleges that you violated the open meeting law and it's based on an action, you'd want to make sure that you cured that within 30 days. So work with your attorney if that comes up, because the details for ratification are very specific. And the 12th rule are the penalties that are attached to the open meeting law. The Attorney General is the primary enforcer of the law. They take complaints, and a lot of them. County attorneys also have jurisdiction, but typically don't get involved. There is a provision in the law that allows for a civil enforcement action. So a citizen can sue you in the court for violation of the open meeting law. And just the mere, allegation and a public investigation of the possible violation can make it difficult for you to do your jobs, and again, eroding that public trust. So we want to try to avoid those when we can. The violations are $500 fine per violation for a knowing violation, or aiding or agreeing to aid or attempting to aid another person in a violation. The district does not cover that fine. There is no insurance for it. It comes right out of your pocket. And a second offense is a $2,500 fine per violation. There's a provision in the open meeting law that says that if you're the one person on the board that says, hey, I think we're violating the open meeting law, and I think we're violating this because of this, so we ought to not do that, and you state that on the record, well, when it comes to enforce the law, they're going to treat you, with a little bit of flexibility, let's say. So keep that in mind. But a court can remove a governing board member from office for violation of the open meeting law, and we have seen that happen in school boards. It has been a while since it happened, but it was very difficult for the district involved where that happened. So in short, know the law, ask questions of your superintendent, ask questions of your lawyer. I can be here for information if you have questions. I can't be your lawyer, but I can certainly point you in the right direction about what the law is. And with that, I'm happy to answer any other questions that you might have.
Chris, I have a question. We can go back way back when we were talking about the getting together sessions to discuss things that aren't on the agenda necessarily, but that could be on the agenda. I'm still confused about that because and I guess just because I'm new to this, but I'm trying to figure how, if a board is trying to look at going forward and all of the things that could be discussed and need to be discussed in order to improve the district or improve the education that's going on, or how does one do that if you can't get together ahead of time and discuss these possible items? Because it's really difficult to me anyway, and I guess just being new, I'm trying to get my head around this, about if you're only together during that time and you're only specifically talking about those agenda items, how do you talk about the future?
Yeah.
And if you do, if what I'm hearing, every time we do something like that, we have to invite the public also to listen to that discussion about going forward. Can you clear that up for me? Am I thinking right about this? Or?
What a lot of districts do is they have regular work study sessions. Some do it once a month, some do it once a quarter. And that's where they will talk about big picture items. And, in talking about where the district goes, you're talking about, what's your strategic plan? What's your vision? What's your mission? And those kind of things are good to talk about in a work study session or in a retreat. At ASBA, we can help facilitate that if you need that. But that's where the big picture discussions happen. And then you still have to have an agenda. The public is still invited, but the agenda is going to be broader. It's going to say, discussion of strategic planning, strategic goals for the district, in the coming school year. That's enough to have, a pretty broad discussion about where the district's going and where it is. And then, out of that discussion, if there are specific points of agreement or the board has a general consensus about, addressing certain items, then that can be teed up for the next agenda or some future agenda, in a regular meeting where those are, if there's recommendations or action to be taken, you can take them up. Yeah.
So that type of meeting would still be posted like any other board meeting?
It's
To
still
the
a board
public.
meeting, yeah. But it just has a, it has a more broad agenda where you can have those kind of, more, those discussions that I think you want to have.
Okay. And I'm one more question, and just again, trying to just understand. Typically, the normal items on an agenda, are those talked about as possible things during an open meeting that might occur in the agenda, or are they talked about privately between all board members, some board members, and the superintendent, or how do typically items wind up on an agenda?
That's a great question. So, and Nikki referred to the B section policies. So one of those policies, BEDBA, is your agenda setting policy. And if you have the ASBA model policy, which you've adopted as your own, it basically says that the superintendent, in consultation with the board president, representing the board as a whole, will create the agenda. And there's also a provision that allows board members to submit items for consideration within a certain time period. There is also, many districts will, as part of their meetings, at the end of their agenda, allow for board members to suggest future agenda items. They can't discuss the substance of those items, but they can have a one-way communication saying, I'd love to see us have, a discussion about this at some point. And then, when the planning is for the next meetings, the administration could say, let us do some, legwork on that. And we can do that a month from now, and we'll be ready to have that conversation. Something like that, where you're just talking about logistical issues, not whether or not, it's a good idea or not, because that's something.
So that would be on the agenda like any other item, as sort of a closing yes. Agenda item. Okay.
Yes, you can conclude your meeting that way before your adjournment. Many districts do. And that would be another way for all board members to have access to the agenda.
Okay.
So we have a training that Julie and I do called Communication Protocols. And one of the things that we cover in there is agenda setting process, because we do believe that it's important for everybody to be on the same page as to how to get an agenda on the agenda. We think it's important that, board presidents understand that they're not necessarily there to only pick things that they want to talk about. They're there to help make sure that all board members get an opportunity to discuss the items. Now, they may come back to you if it doesn't seem like the agenda item you're asking is relevant to your strategic plan or goals or something like that. And they may put it back to the board to say, does the board want to make this an agenda item and spend time and resources? So I'll give you an example. If you had a board member that wanted to do a deep dive into literacy programs or the PTO programs, and you wanted to have you wanted the superintendent to provide a report and then have a discussion around that. And that's the board president or superintendent were like, I don't know if that's priority right now. Let's take it back to the board, because that's going to take lots of hours and time on the part of staff to come up with. They may decide to put on the agenda, does the board want us to pursue generating this report and discussion? If the majority of the board says no, then it would be okay for the board president and say, at this time, we're not gonna have that on an agenda. But at least the board member who presented it had an opportunity to ask the peers if they would consider that. The reason for that is we don't want a single board member asking for a bunch of agenda items and having the staff have to work to complete those and taking up time that the majority of the board doesn't want to spend time on. I'll also say that it's good to have a protocol and a practice in place for how to track those things. In our district, what we do is we do have a call to the at the end for any future agenda items. A board member will have to be vague. I want to report on SROs. They don't have to say anything more. They can't say anything more. And other than that, and usually what happens is our board secretary will follow back up with us and say, what specifically is it that you want? And then they'll work with us to get that on the agenda or get us a report. She tracks all requests. And so there's a Google document that the board can see, hey, that's what I requested. And this is the anticipated day that we're going to, or meeting that we're going to discuss it. Or we're not going to discuss it in a meeting, but this is when I can expect a report. And so it makes it really clear of, what things are coming up when you've requested an item. But there's a lot of protocols, I think, that is important for our boards to help build trust, and also for your community to have consistency to establish some of those protocols. So that's where reviewing your policy and having a communications protocol training can be very beneficial to boards.
Thank you.
I have a question on the study sessions.
Sure.
Will decisions be made for that, or will they just take recommendations to the next board meeting where you can have a discussion with the board meeting and a recommendation or decision?
Well, typically a study session, by definition, is not one where you take action.
Okay.
It's intended to be, just we're going to get information, we're going to ask lots of questions, we're going to learn something about this, and then, chart a course of action at some future time.
Okay.
So an example of this is when we've done board self-evaluations, we'll do that in a study session where the board gets to see how they rated themselves in certain areas. They get to talk about what areas they think may be a priority. And then they may even come up with some draft goals for themselves. And I always leave those sessions with, okay, well, we can come to some consensus. We may even assign a board member or two to work with the superintendent to draft something, but we always recommend that they take it to a regular meeting and present that and ratify it or approve it for formally.
I have one other question. There was something brought up in our last board meeting, a situation that we're dealing with. So I'm having basically a study session with the teachers that it affects at the high school next Tuesday. So does that have to be posted or in a public forum, or can I just meet with the teachers to discuss a solution to the problem?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about, study sessions, we're talking about, study session of the board and a board meeting. Now, you may have administrative meetings that you call study sessions with various groups. They're not meetings of the board. You don't have to post anything, and they're not public meetings.
And in that particular meeting, it sounds like it wouldn't really be appropriate for board members to be in that meeting anyway.
Just because it was a discussion at the board meeting, I didn't know if board members wanted to go or not, but probably not.
Just in my opinion, when we talk about oversight or overstep, if an issue comes up for the board, we just want to, board members should make sure that it's being addressed. And if you're addressing it and you're having a conversation, you can always report back to the board. But I wouldn't necessarily see it as a role of the board to sit into that conversation. Again, kind of like what we talked about before, board members don't realize that they do, even though they don't have any individual authority, when they are in spaces, staff often change behavior or may not feel as open to being transparent with that. So I think it's always, in my opinion, as a board member, best to let those things happen without, and then get the follow-up from the superintendent about how that went.
Okay, thank you.
Nikki, all of the trainings that you have mentioned, the one on communication and the others, are all of those trainings posted? Or do you ask specifically for them based on need, or how does that work?
I will put a link to our training page, and then you can look through them. There's descriptions of them there. And then there's a form that requests training, and that form your superintendent, board secretary, or board president can fill out, and it basically gives us some times and dates you're looking at at meeting, like a time frame, whether you like nights or weekends, and it'll give us topics, and then we'll reach out to you and discuss specifically what it is that you want. But I will put in the chat right now a link to our training page so you can see some of the things that we offer and approximately how much time to allot for this.
All right. Thank you.
Any other questions for Chris or for me?
Thank you all. Let me know. I mean, again, I mentioned before, I'm available to give you some information, give you, point you in the right direction, answer sort of informal questions. And if it looks like it's a matter for you to get legal advice about, I will certainly, suggest that you call your lawyer.
And just as before you wrap your meeting up, just as a housekeeping measure, this is recorded and it is being streamed. However, we have limited capacity on our cloud for the Zoom format. So we do go through every week or so and delete these. You do have to provide minutes for the study session. So if your plan was to use the recording as your minutes, I would recommend that I will send you the link and that you download that as soon as possible, or go to the YouTube page and download it from there to save it on your system. Otherwise, you would need to do minutes for this if you're not going to use the recording. But just to know it's temporary, we don't hold on to these for you indefinitely.
I want to thank you both for doing this. It helped me out a lot. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. It takes a lot. It is a characteristic of getting together and meeting and taking that extra time outside the board meeting. So I appreciate you all making time for that. With that, we'll turn it back over to you to adjourn your meeting as you would normally.
Thank you, and I appreciate you guys taking the time to train us. It was definitely informative. I would take a motion. I would like to take a motion, or I would entertain a motion, I'm sorry, for an adjournment.
I motion to adjourn this meeting.
I'll second it.
Thank you. Thank you. Here we have a motion, first and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Adjourning at 6:47.
All right.
Thank you all.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Chris.
You're welcome.
Have a good weekend.
You too.
Bye.